Hello horror nerds, and welcome back to my channel. Tonight's stories are brought to you by author RedNovaTyrant from the Creepypasta Wiki. If you enjoy the story, be sure to check out the author. And if you enjoy the narration, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't. A quick note before the stories begin. I've recently upgraded some of my recording equipment, so each individual story may vary in quality and volume as I've tried to get used to the microphone over the time I spent recording these stories. And with that, enjoy the stories. The Greenhouse Effect. When an exploration team was scouring the jungles of Africa, they found it. Their original purpose for being there had been an attempt to find the cause of multiple dangerous diseases that had been sourcing from the region over the last few years, therefore finding a way to reduce the rising number of epidemics. What they found instead was something else entirely. The Garden of Eden that the team had stumbled upon, deep in unexplored territory, was filled with plants and fungi the likes of which had never been found before. Purple ferns and red-stained trees surrounded a crystal-clear pool of water, with large pitch-black roots all drinking from it in many directions. The area was relatively dark and quite humid, enveloped under a canopy of trees. Many fruits of beautiful colors hung from branches overhead, but despite this area being a gold mine for animals or people, there were no signs of disturbance. No commonly tread paths, no footprints, not a trace. The most intriguing thing about the life forms of Eden was that they were almost all physically interconnected through various vines and growths. The explorers were astonished by the sight. The head researcher of the group, one Dr. Kenneth Parsons, immediately signaled back to their base for permission from higher authority to change their objective. The proposal was accepted. After a few days of researching the plants in their natural habitat, it was found that these plants were untouched by any known disease to man, and the team decided to return with a broad variety of smaller plants and fungi to be studied back in America in secret. When the team first began collecting, they attempted to disconnect one of the vines between a plant and fungus. It took a strenuous amount of labor to sever the connection, and upon doing so, the plant dried up almost instantly, and the fungus wheezed out a cloud of spores, to which the researchers stayed far from. After that, all samples were dug up and collected in twos, a connecting plant and fungus, with a supply of water. Once home, they were set up in a facility by their employers, which contained a massive industrial greenhouse with steel walls and a glass ceiling. It was built to have the same temperature and the decreased light as their habitat, as well as some rocks and ponds. The government showed some interest in the matter and gave the group some ample funding. However, the funding was given under the condition that all information was to be channeled through them before it reached the public. Dr. Parsons, having been given the head position for the new project, agreed. More people were recruited onto the project and research continued. More interesting features of the Eden plants and fungi were uncovered over the days to come. One researcher made note that the plants immediately began spreading their roots towards the closest of the ponds. After water intake was established, the plants began to grow towards the fungi, beginning the vast network of small vines across the greenhouse floor. Further analysis of the connecting vines showed that upon severing them, a translucent fluid would spill out. Naturally, the substance was collected for analysis. The water roots also perplexed the scientists. In only a matter of days, the roots had grown into complete bark. When they tried to take a sample, the wood could not be splintered with a basic knife. So they grabbed an axe and attempted that, but it too failed to break the wood. A chainsaw was brought in, but just like the others, it was to no avail, as the root ground down the teeth of the saw after only 30 minutes of continuous cutting. Barely a mark was left on the root. They tried burning the root, but it wouldn't light. Gasoline only burned on its surface, and the fire went out the moment all the fuel was used. The root was not charred at all, but after this attempt, the root seemed to creak and groan, which unsettled some of the more superstitious researchers. Then they remembered the connection vines. They cut a section of one vine that was keeping a plant and fungus together, effectively killing the plant and the fungus shortly after its death burst. In a 2-for-1 grab, the researchers took the plant and its root, as well as some of the spores of the fungus, to be examined. Various durability tests were conducted on the eaten root alone, the plant being little more than wilted compost at that point, and the results were astounding. The root was able to withstand incredible forces, surviving through bullets, hydraulic presses, and even an explosion or two, before even showing signs of cracking or splintering. Many of the researchers jumped for joy. If they could collect this wood efficiently, in usable sizes, they'd change the world of construction. Hell, the entire market, as well as making a pretty penny on the side. But some of the researchers grew nervous at this sight, calling it abnormal and claiming that they shouldn't be messing with nature like this. The researchers with higher authority, including Parsons, scoffed at the worriers, giving them an ultimatum: either continue working on the project and share in the riches to come, or leave. Most of them hung up their lab coats that day. While the nature of the spores and the translucent liquid were being determined, there was one slight problem that needed to be addressed. The plants and fungi, now referred together as the Edenites, grew at an exponential rate and had begun to dominate the greenhouse. Navigating their way through the area had become quite the hassle, and there were some concerns of overgrowth eventually having a negative effect on lab equipment in the greenhouse. As the researchers were too busy with their work to constantly take care of their ever-expanding garden, due to recent decrease in participants, they decided to hire someone specifically for maintaining the garden. After receiving permission from the government, a public job offering was listed across the country, wanting a gardener or lawn care expert to maintain a government-funded greenhouse. Many people were excited. Having the chance to see a government project firsthand, especially the Eden Wood project, would be an amazing opportunity. After a few days and cycling through many applications, some of which were found to be fake, the group decided on a man named Adam Stevens. Adam was, for lack of a better term, just your average Joe. He had a family of 4, worked as the owner of a lawn care service business, and had some practice in lumbering from his father as a kid. He was very kind and gentle, though his use of language was sometimes misplaced or not appropriate for the environment. Regardless, he never used his words to directly hurt anyone, and would always greet people with a smile. But most of all, Adam didn't complain or ask too many questions. The exact kind of person Parsons and his team were looking for. After a successful interview, the researchers joked about his name and the coincidence of it regarding the situation. Adam laughed and agreed, then got right to work. By the time he had arrived, there were a few trees beginning to form in the greenhouse. "In the beginning, there were a fuck ton of trees," Adam stated upon first entering the garden. The researchers, keeping a peripheral eye on him, laughed as his response was played over the intercom throughout the facility. As a part of the job, Adam agreed to have all of his actions in the greenhouse recorded through camera and microphone, as to make sure he did not damage the Edenites or try anything potentially dangerous. But there was no worry to be had. Adam simply did his job, all whilst talking continuously like a radio host as he trimmed the plants from the doors and pathways, jokingly complaining about the damn ferns and the grass that was tougher to cut than an overcooked boot.
Good morning, this is Radio Genesis, and I'm your host, Adam Stevens, and today we have this cluster of purple ferns to clear out from entrance ED612.
The researchers, still in a merry trance from the continuing positive results of the Eden root tests, played along and would add music breaks over the intercom to add in Adam's narrative. Some pieces of their research had also finally been made public, though only in bits and pieces. But hearing the public's growing excitement and interest in the garden, especially in the Eden Woods' capabilities, only fueled the team's drive to pursue the garden's truths, and perhaps swelled some egos on the side. Personnel morale was at an all-time high, and research was going smoothly. After a month of work, the team gathered together to hold a meeting to discuss their current findings involving the Garden of Eden. 22 people from the team sat down at a large circular table behind a locked door with no one to eavesdrop on them. They began by reiterating what they had already found, along with many new and interesting, perhaps even shocking revelations. The secret of the spores had been cracked. They were the ecosystem's main means of reproduction, explaining why the garden was so secluded. Hidden away in a dense jungle with little wind, and the fruits from the trees found to have only a central seed within, added to the lack of interaction with animals, meant that the garden couldn't spread very far. The translucent liquid's purpose was even more shocking. It appeared that the symbiosis between the plants and fungi were even deeper than expected. The plant delivered water mixed with various nutrients to the fungus, which converted the fluid into energy that was shared between the two. As there was little sunlight for the plant to absorb for fuel, a self-preserving cycle of continuity. Once again, this new knowledge made many of the researchers stand and applaud, some even shout and jump around, but not all were impressed. One researcher nervously interrupted the celebration, claiming that upon studying the spores, they also contained endospores of an unknown culture, and thought the project should be halted, if not outright abandoned. The others, furious at him for spoiling their moment of glory with unnecessary worries, began shouting and berating him, one going so far as throwing a punch. Parsons immediately put an end to the riot, and grabbed the group's attention by announcing the discovery that the trees were found to be made of the same wood as the plant roots. Though they were pleased, murmurs of bitterness still lingered throughout the meeting. Over the next few days, the team sneered and glared at the traitor, and the atmosphere of the facility heavily declined into one of hatred. Fearing for his life, the researcher responsible for finding the endospores quit shortly after. Work continued, but no longer at the impressive rate it once was. Thoughts of a possible disease lingering in the garden, in their sacred grounds, had poisoned the minds of the researchers, ever present in the back of their minds. The pressure of trying to impress the outside world with new discoveries also wavered their ability to work effectively. Nothing new was found about the Edenites for a while. The endospore culture was never identified, and the garden continued to grow faster and larger. Adam continued working inside the biome, attempting to keep the growth under control, but his cheery demeanor was no longer welcomed by the research team. The only ones paying attention were a handful required to do so. Eventually, he only began to talk and sing to himself, as the team spent less time coming into the garden for samples and more time in the labs investigating. 5 weeks into the project, and there was next to no new progress made. The trees in the garden had grown to a massive size, centralized around one of particularly large size. The growth was so much so that a great deal of natural light had been blocked, and floodlights were brought into the environment. No effective means had been found to harvest the Eden wood yet, and after a week of constant work with little development, the researchers were becoming agitated. One even screamed at Adam for asking if he should cut down the trees, claiming that he was unworthy to even be in the garden, much less touch the priceless trees. Adam was paid a settlement to stay quiet about the incident and continue working, to which he hesitantly accepted. Another meeting was held, but this time it was only between the upper-rank researchers. Parsons entered the room silently and gazed upon his associates. Everyone seemed rather paranoid or frustrated, with raccoon eyes and chapped lips. Parsons' gaze caught a researcher gnawing on his finger, and upon eye contact, the researcher immediately stopped, but continued staring at Parsons unnervingly longer than needed.
We need some form of progress. Anything. Everyone here and out there is thirsting for knowledge, and we have nothing new to satiate that thirst.
One of the researchers exclaimed. That bastard! Maybe that whole endospore nonsense was just to slow us down, to distract us.
Yes. If we don't act soon, we'll have a riot on our hands.
Another protested. The government is breathing down our necks, Ken, a third mentioned. If we don't come up with anything new soon, they'll surely shut us down. Or worse, replace us. Just think of all the secrets that Garden still has left to offer, that we can find. Parsons nodded slowly in agreement, the heavy bags under his eyes showing his exhaustion. I've had an idea for an experiment for some time. He explained his proposal to the others, and where most people would have immediately turned it down, in their depraved and almost primal states, they agreed if it meant they could further study the garden. A few days later, as work was continuing at its declining rate, the researchers that took part in the meeting walked to the greenhouse control room. From there, between the many purple and red leaves covering the window, they could make out the figure of Adam working away on a group of Edenites whose vines had been cut. No one else was inside yet. Parsons swallowed, turned his key in a slot on the control panel, and hit a button. Within a moment, all of the doors to the garden were systematically locked.
Hey, fellas, what you doing up there?
Adam's voice echoed over the intercom. They forgot to shut it off. Parsons cleared his throat and answered into a microphone very carefully. Adam, we appreciate everything you've done for us, but now we need you for an experiment.
No!
Adam screamed, cutting off the researcher and making the intercom squeal. Even the branches of the trees seemed to flinch slightly.
This isn't what I signed up for! You motherfuckers! You tricked me! You tricked me! You can't just lock me up in here!
He began to swing his shears against the door closest to him, and then his shovel.
You bastards! Let me out! Let me out!
Of course, all of this was being broadcast throughout the facility. Everyone understood immediately what Adam's screams meant, and a few even ran to the control room to see, as the greenhouse had no other viewing windows. Adam, please calm down. All of the basic necessities are in there. You have food, water, warmth, and shelter. We just wish to see the results of an animal living in the garden. We will let you out. Parsons paused for a moment, trying to think of what to tell him. We will let you out when we have sufficient data.
You'll pay!
Adam began to scream, but then the intercom was turned off. All throughout the facility, the researchers heard of Adam's fate, as decided by their supervisor. Many began to smile wickedly to themselves, the excitement of this new test's outcome thrilling them deep down and motivating them to work harder. But once again, there were others who were mortified by what Parsons had just done, and whilst trying to hold back tears and screams, they quit the project too. Only a fifth of the original team remained. Productivity skyrocketed, despite the low number of workers. People flocked to and from stations, one experiment to the next, all in the name of Adam. They wanted to know if the endospores would affect him, if the fruit or water would change his behavior, how the Edenites would react to his presence. All outside communications, including sending their findings to the government, was seen as a distraction and a waste of time. taking away from precious research time to write copies of reports and updates. Only small drips of information were leaked out to the government after that, otherwise the group was silent. They had no need of the outside world. The facility had living quarters and enough food and drink to feed them for 25 years, in the event of some global epidemic or apocalypse. The blast doors has also been shut, the only true in and out from the facility. But no one else wanted to leave anyways. The knowledge they sought was just within their grasp. Parsons now spent the majority of his time observing the garden and Adam from the control room. For the first few days, Adam attempted to break out, cycling between methods of rage and peace. When bashing against the door didn't work, he'd go back to work on overgrowth or try to persuade Parsons to release him. And when there was no response, he'd go back to shouting and kicking and screaming. Somewhere deep down, agony and remorse struck Parsons' heart, but his drive for knowledge overwhelmed those feelings, and he continued to record data. After the fourth day, Adam gave up on trying to open the door himself, and instead began exploring the enclosure. This made for slightly more difficult observation, as the branches had continued to grow over the window since the room was so high up, and sometimes Adam would disappear from sight altogether. He would reappear every now and then, occasionally seen eating one of the garden's fruits. Once he looked straight up to the control window and gave a gesture to Parsons, reflecting his opinion of this experiment quite bluntly. After the seventh day, Adam became much harder to find, not only from the dimmed lighting and the number of branches blocking Parsons' view, but also Adam seemingly hiding from view. When he did appear, each time he looked more raggedy, his clothes more torn up and falling apart, and he was always carrying at least one fruit with him. He would constantly gnaw into the fruit's tough exterior and then suck on its inner juice. Parsons wasn't sure, but he thought he heard Adam mumbling something about the food of truth. More quiet ramblings could be heard, but specific words couldn't be picked out. The Edenites were overgrowing due to the lack of maintenance, and the cameras and microphones slowly became less usable. On the 12th day, a researcher visited Parsons. She had come to tell him that she had finally found the identity of the endospore culture. It was a new strain of anthrax, one that only affected plants, which explained the large black roots. Parsons nodded, half interested, then sat forward in his chair towards the window. "Doctor? Do you see that?" Both of them ran over to the window to see Adam lurking out from behind a tree, nearly naked. "What is he?" the researcher started before gasping. Adam stepped out further and revealed the large, pulsing fungus attached to his upper thigh. He reached down, picked up a rotten fruit that had fallen weeks ago, then licked his lips and proceeded to devour the fruit whole. The rotted flesh swirling across his lips, juices flowing down his chin, and the quiet crunching of the core could be heard over the intercom. Parsons resisted the urge to gag, looked away, then back when he heard some quiet laughter.
"Food for my friend."
Adam patted the fungus on his thigh, and then disappeared into another bush. The next day, Parsons gathered the entire team to discuss Adam's changes. Upon finishing his report, most of the group appeared to be struck by dread, disturbed by the events Parsons had described to them. Others appeared unaffected, their eyes dreary and dull from exhaustion. Parsons gave them a look, a thought of concern crossing his mind for just a moment. A few researchers sitting together were chattering unusually eagerly amongst themselves. "Why are you guys so excited about this?" Parsons demanded, almost shouting at them as he came out of his own daze. They paused, looked at one another, and then one stood. "You claim that Adam ate the fruit, and that he murmured of the fruit of truth. This could be it, Parsons. The answer we've spent the last 2 months looking for. The secret of the garden could very well be in that fruit." Parsons thought for a moment. No one else but Adam had partaken of the Eden fruit, as it was still deemed unsafe to eat untested exotic foods, and it rotted quickly when picked, even when refrigerated or in its natural climate, so keeping it on the trees was common practice. There were no samples left in the lab at this point, but if the fruit was the key to the garden's secrets... I'm not comfortable about the effects of the fruit happening to myself, or any of you. Besides, we shouldn't interrupt the experiment. Adam might be very close to something extraordinary. It shall continue its course, and when it is done, the fruit will be investigated. The group slowly nodded, relaxing at the thought that their final goal had possibly just been found. Adam was only seen once more, on the 19th day, protruding from a pond. His skin was stretched to the bone, and his only coverings now were plants and fungi. The Edenites had spread onto his other leg and now were on his chest and left arm as well, and all over his person. Connecting him to the Edenites were vines. After this sighting, the branches grew more and completely covered the window. With only one option remaining, Parsons tried to make contact with Adam for the first time since the trial began. Adam? Adam? Can you hear me? What are you doing in there? Why don't you come out so we can talk? There was no sound for a while, and then suddenly, there was a scratching noise coming towards the microphone. It made a squeak. The sounds of shuffling could be heard. And then Adam responded,
I don't need, let alone you. Well, you know what? Interfering in my garden, fuckers! Unworthy. No trespassers.
A cracking sound ripped through the intercom and was preceded by similar sounds in a sequence. The TV screens turned to static. Adam had ripped out the microphones and the cameras. Unable to continue his observation, Parsons decided that the experiment needed a break, so he ordered for some of the tougher researchers to go in and sedate Adam should he resist coming out, then bring him out for examination. But although he unlocked the door to the garden, Adam did not come out, and when they tried to open the door, it would not budge. They tried to use the controls to open it. Nothing. It was assumed that the wood had locked the door somehow, perhaps caught in its mechanisms, and now it was stuck. The same fate was assumed for the rest of the entrances. A strange feeling began to fill Parsons from his head to his rubber-heeled shoes. He couldn't explain it, but he felt anxious. Everyone was awakened by a loud metallic sound that rattled through the facility a few days later. Outside, authorities were trying to force their way inside the lab. With little to no word from the research team for weeks, the government was taking action and trying to cut, pry, and blast their way in. The doors were strong, but they wouldn't last forever. Perhaps 3 hours at best, less if they had sent the military. Parsons began to sweat, along with the other researchers. The truth of this strange nature, he almost had it. He sprinted for the control room. All he could think about was getting inside the garden, obtaining the fruit, the food of truth Adam spoke of. He went to the microphone and screamed, "Adam! They're coming for us! They're finally coming in and they're going to end the experiment! I need in! Please, I need into the greenhouse! Let us in, goddammit!" There was, of course, no response through the intercom, as the microphones were already destroyed. For all Parsons knew, the speakers inside were dead as well. Something buzzed in Parsons' pocket, his cell phone. He opened it and saw a message from one of the other researchers. The door just opened. Parsons sprinted back down to the greenhouse entrance, where the others were staring into the open doorway. Parsons joined them and stood witness to the archway of Edenwood that now surrounded the door, with branches of red and purple, brown and black, extending around, twisting and turning, moving. One researcher, the one who spoke about the fruit being the answer at the last meeting, stepped forward cautiously, careful not to lose his footing on the forest floor laced with roots for him to trip on. He took one step, another step, one more, before the blood splattered across the researcher's coats. One of the roots had stuck outwards and pierced straight through his neck. It gushed out like a raging river, and whatever fell into the soil of the greenhouse was absorbed. The root then turned the man's hanging corpse towards them, and his mouth opened as branches filled the inside of it. In a voice like creaking floorboards, he spoke, "One man, one woman, hand in hand." The root then retracted, throwing the drained corpse to the side of the tunnel. Parsons swallowed and slowly turned to the rest of the team, who had slowly backed away, save the only woman left among the group, the woman who had discovered the anthrax culture. A blast was heard coming from the main entrance. The military had gotten involved. Parsons frantically offered his hand out to the woman. "Please, I need to know. I must know before we're taken away. I'm scared too, but the unknown is always terrifying. That's why I have to do this, otherwise I'll regret everything I've done here. Please." His hand shook violently towards the woman, her eyes to the floor, but slowly looking up at him. After a deep, shaky sigh, she took his hand, and they stood together in front of the tunnel. "Before we go, your name?" Parsons asked quietly, facing forward. "It's Kim. Yours?" "Kenneth," he replied. The two stepped together into the tunnel, past the body of their associate. Slowly. Nothing happened. The branches continued twisting, but nothing struck them. Parsons took another step, and another, each one feeling as though his feet were sticking to the ground. Kim seemed to have the same feeling running through her body. Shaking, they entered the garden, and very slowly, a tangle of Edenwood covered the doorway. The other researchers shouted and called for them to turn back, but they ignored them. Even if the way back had been opened, there was no reason for them to turn back now. The two continued into the greenhouse, now a massive pitch-black forest. Parsons looked up, and a chill ran down his spine as he realized something. When he had seen it back in Africa, it was only beautiful as the light came in between the trees, and the blue and greens of the normal plant life made this place vibrant and beautiful. But in here, there were no normal trees. There was no green grass. The trees stretched high above their heads and formed a purple canopy of red and purple, with twisting black streaks. This was their sky now. Kim screamed and squeezed Parsons' hand hard. He winced, then looked at where she was pointing. There was a plant, roughly the size of a big dog, pulsating, bulging. They moved closer to get a look, and when they could make it out in the dim light of a far-off floodlight, Kim turned her head away and threw up, while Parsons only stared. It was a human heart, or at least a plant shaped like one, and it was pumping. The black roots drew water from the pond nearby, and was then pushed through the heart into vines, now reformed like blood vessels and intestines. The path ahead had more and more of this disturbed Edenites. Parsons couldn't help wondering, why are they forming this way? What is going on here? Everything twitched and breathed, like real organs, as the two continued through the brush. They felt as though they'd never find their way out again, in the darkness and grotesque of this foul, corrupted garden, but it didn't matter. Only the truth mattered now. At one point, Parsons thought about calling out for Adam, but decided against it. Only God knew what had become of him in this realm. It was then that both of the researchers realized it. There were no more fruits hanging from the trees, nor were there any on the ground around them. Kim began to panic.
Where are they? Where are the fruits? That's the only reason we came in here, for the fruits. Where the fuck are they?
Calm down, Kim. They're in here somewhere.
I need to find them. I can't waste this chance.
Kim slipped from Parsons' hand and ran off into the bush.
Kim!
He screamed out for her, but no response. He immediately gave chase after Kim and tripped over one of the mussel vines. He got back up and continued straight forward. Not too long after, he came out into a clearing. Two things immediately shocked him: a piercing pain that was shoved into his stomach, and the horrified face of Kim, her mouth agape, blood leaking out of her mouth, her eyes wide in fear and staring straight at Parsons. He tried to look away, but when he did, he wished he was still caught in the death gaze. It was the tree, the one that the garden had centralized itself around. The trunk was constantly shifting and churning, like an unruly ocean. The branch that had struck him moved, and he had to look away for a moment, but his gaze was quickly transfixed upon the tree once more. Red, black, purple, all swirling and filling his sight. The Edenites, morphed into those shapes of human organs, all fed into this tree. And there, bound to the tree, grown into it, was Adam. Vines bulged and their contents crawled their way from every direction towards his body, now blackened and turned to bark. His torso had split open, revealing corrupted innards still pumping, a black heart beating within his exposed ribcage, yet no blood trickled from him. His eyes stood out more than anything. A milky, bright white, no colors, no iris. The image horrified Parsons, and in that instant, his greed, his pride, his unquenchable thirst for information was stripped of him. All he felt now was fear. Absolute and total fear of the power that was before him. Fear of this abomination that he helped bring about.
Parsons!
The tree Adam croaked, his Eden wood face creaking as he spoke.
You came, and you brought an Eve. How marvelous.
Enough, Adam, Parsons said, coughing up some blood. It's over. The experiment's through. It's a failure, and they're going to destroy this monstrosity. Adam turned his head slightly, unblinking, watching Parsons with his marble-smooth eyes.
Monstrosity? Oh no. No. You don't understand, do you?
A branch descended from overhead and stretched itself in two directions, one to Adam and one to Parsons. Before his eyes, a yellow fruit bloomed and grew at each end of the branch. Adam struggled to stretch out his neck before plunging his teeth into the fruit and devouring it instantly. Parsons restrained himself from the urge. Here it was, the fruit, the food of truth.
What are you waiting for?
Adam asked, the echo in his voice still prevalent.
This is what you wanted, is it not? The knowledge, the secrets of the garden.
No thanks. Not if it means I end up like you, Parsons spat. Adam chuckled, and the whole garden quaked. Parsons used every remaining ounce of his strength to not black out.
Foolish man, just submit already. There is no garden of God,
Nay, it is quite the opposite. It is the orchard of the underworld, with fruit born from the Lady of Hades. The branches groaned, reacting to Adam, who was in what seemed to be pleasure. You see, the more I fed, the more my eyes were opened. Infinite wisdom filled my mind, thus the closer I came to God, until at last I stole his secrets. And behold, this garden and I are one, bound forever, through the symbiotic chains that we share. Adam sighed, confirming his disturbed happiness. Parsons' eyes began to close, his vision blurring. There was a brightness in the center of his vision, a yellow light surrounded by darkness and blood. I am the new Garden of Eden. My wisdom is infinite, and my body can never be broken. I want to enlighten this world. All will join under my canopy, gain the wisdom of the fruit, and become one in the garden. Eat of this, the fruit of my body. Parsons' eyes finally shut, a sliver of his strength remaining. This is the end of my hunt. In the search for knowledge, we should have known better. But we fucked with the unknown, and now, well, there's no time for doubt now. And he bit into the fruit. The shifts. If there's anyone out there reading this, please help me. I heard that this community seems to have a fascination with this kind of thing, so maybe someone has some information that could help me. Maybe they've experienced the same problem I have. I've contacted other sites and people about my situation. Thanks in advance for any help you can offer me. I should probably set the stage here. I work in a mirror factory as an inspector. Most of the work in making a mirror is already automated, but it's always up to a human eye to determine whether or not the mirror's reflection is up to standards. Hence my position, checking for any bubbles or cracks or such when a pane is complete. In the factory itself, there's probably only about 30 of us in total. We tend to ship out a lot more large mirror panes than actually cutting or designing some mirrors, the kind you might find in a gym or such. An industrial supplier, you might call us. And as I said, it was my job along with some others to check these panes for faults. Everything at work was going fine, that is until about a month ago. At that time, there had been a break-in during the night for the first time since I'd gotten my job over 2 years ago. But the weird thing about the break-in was that nothing was stolen, and nothing was broken, save for one door's lock that led outside, leading to the security alarm's activation. The only thing the intruder had seemingly done was open the silver vat. Mirrors are reflective thanks to silver, if you weren't aware. But the silver we use is already in liquid form. They must have not known that, or just couldn't get any, and decided to take off. Security footage was useless, as it had been too dark to tell who it had been, or what discernible features they might have had that would give them away. Regardless, the police did their investigating and couldn't come up with anything, so my boss hired some security guards to keep watch during the night. Work continued as normal by day, but then, the very next night, there was another break-in. One of the guards was hospitalized, and though I never got to see him myself, word spread that his arm had been snapped in 3 places. The image was not pleasing to think about. This time, once again, nothing had been touched, but now not even the silver vat had been opened. And just as before, there were no clues as to who had done it. Some of the workers became a little concerned, but my boss calmed them down and assured them that there was nothing to worry about, as it only happened during the night. Everyone just returned to their work, myself included, a bit skeptical of the safety of the factory. After the second incident, though, I began to notice something strange while doing my inspections. The mirror just didn't seem to be properly reflecting what was happening. One time, my friend Greg passed behind me while I was working and called my name. I turned to wave to him, but upon looking back, I thought my reflection waved a little longer, and it seemed to be waving at me. I shrugged it off as just a trick of the eye. It was also summertime, and I was working in a factory after all, so the possibility of heat stroke had crossed my mind. Another time, I was walking along the length of a pane when my reflection, it almost seemed to stop for a moment, like it was inspecting a part of the mirror. I blinked and shook my head, and when I opened my eyes, my reflection was looking right back at me, plain as day. The tricks became more common, and soon I would find myself staring into a mirror for minutes, and minutes turned into hours, trying to catch the other me acting out before someone would come over and pull me from the trance. Usually it was my boss. I'd apologize and get back to work, having to stay later into the evening to make up my lack of inspections throughout the day. Though, when he could, Greg would stay with me and help check some of the panes. One evening, while Greg was helping me out, I thought I had seen my reflection knock on the glass in front of me. Granted, I didn't hear anything, but the sudden movement was enough to startle me. I shouted and, in an act of pure, frightened instinct, punched the pane. Needless to say, the whole thing shattered. Greg ran over and helped wrap my bleeding hand and sat me down. He asked me what was going on. "You just stand there, staring into the mirrors now. Is there something wrong with your panes? Do they feel weird or something? Should we get someone to look at the machines?" I shook my head. They didn't feel any different than usual. They had the same typical smoothness with little to no smudging, the glass reflective exterior that people purchased from us for. I debated on whether or not I should tell him about my hallucinations, but decided against it out of fear of losing my job. Greg was a good friend, but he'd report my unhealthy mental state in a heartbeat. I told him it was just a lack of sleep, and we cleaned up my mess. I began to lose sleep for real, not just as I had lied to Greg. I lived alone, so there was no one waiting for me to comfort me, to hold me, and tell me it was just my imagination. The thoughts of whether or not what I had seen was real kept me up into the early hours of the morning, and any time I closed my eyes, the scene of my reflection knocking on the mirror would wake me. Only now, in the dream, there was a dull sound of the fist knocking on the glass. Work became a lot more difficult to get through. The inconsistencies occurred more often, or at least appeared that way to me. Sometimes things happened that I knew were not right, like my reflection being on the opposite end of the pane before coming back after a blink, or perhaps the time my reflection actually walked, yes, walked, down the length of the mirror to reach me. I passed out after that incident. Other times were just my own fault, and these were arguably more frightening. Sometimes I'd be holding a cup of coffee in the mirror, and I wouldn't be able to feel the cup, so I would stand paralyzed in terror to avoid looking at my own hand to see if the cup was actually there or not. I couldn't even trust myself, let alone my reflection to tell me what reality was really like anymore. I blamed it more on my increasing insomnia at that point, but the incidents would only feed my obsession. Eventually, my work had become so minimal, my boss asked me to see him in his office. I tried to come up with some story that eventually led to extreme lack of sleep, but he just waved me off and told me that if I didn't shape up soon, that he'd fire me. I'd accidentally let a few bubbles get through inspection, and some buyers had called in to voice their disappointment. The now existing threat of losing my job only compounded to my mental well-being. Another break-in occurred, with the same details as the last two, but this time one of the guards went missing. The police searched for days, but in the end there wasn't a trace of him left. More workers began to get spooked, and a few even quit. I was particularly terrified, and now had even more fuel for my insomnia. My boss finally got the message and decided to hire more guards, as well as assigning a group for daytime patrols. Everyone seemed happy enough with that. I returned home from another unproductive day at work to find something interesting on the news. Apparently, a suspect had been turned in regarding the first break-in at the factory. It turned out that it had been a teenage boy and his two friends who initially entered the factory supposedly just out of curiosity, which clearly meant they were up to no good. The other two boys had decided against breaking in at the last moment, but the third went through with the plan and snuck inside. The boys then explained that after their friend returned, he seemed very different. His behavior was more exaggerated than how he usually acted. Last night, the boy apparently attacked his friends, and after they subdued him, they called the police. The third boy was still under interrogation and wouldn't answer a thing. I had no idea what could have possibly caused this boy to change in such a manner so quickly. After all, my behavior changed over the course of a couple days, not minutes. I shrugged it off and had another sleepless evening. A few days later, just 2 weeks after all of this strangeness started, there was a scream during work hours that pulled me out of my usual trance. It was in my area of the factory, so I rushed over to find the source of the scream. It was another coworker of mine, Julianne. She was pointing at something, to which I turned and tried not to scream myself. Greg was dead, sprawled over a work table, with his neck cut open, and broken pieces of mirror scattered all around him, floating in a pool of blood. The police returned, probably getting quite used to the place, and began asking questions. None of the guards or anyone in the factory had seen anything, but they had immediately responded to Julianne's scream. Makes sense, as our group of inspectors were off in one corner of the factory, and none of us were particularly easy to see without coming right over to talk to us due to the mirror's reflections in the factory's machinery. We were all given time off until the investigation had been completed. I had hoped I would be able to make up for lost sleep, but of course that didn't happen. In fact, the image of Greg's corpse had burned into my mind, and every time I so much as blinked, there he was, his glazed-over eyes rolling towards the back of his head, the torn skin and muscle of his neck standing out in the memory. Since I couldn't sleep, I tried to get my mind off of the weird things in my life by filling the time with gaming, mostly shooters. They were mindless, easy to play, and acted as a great stress reliever, especially when you could mow down an entire enemy team of noobs. I'm getting sidetracked. Greg's death was eventually ruled as a suicide, seeing as how no one else was witness to a suspect, and the broken mirror suggested the tool used. But Greg was usually a very chipper and kind person. He never gave off the vibe that he would off himself like that. Then, when my paranoia had finally reached its peak, a new idea, an insane idea, dawned on me. What if there was someone on the other side? What if Greg had been killed by his reflection? I began doing some research on the idea of alternate dimensions being accessible through mirrors, but all I got back were either some terrible stories written on this site, I imagined out of an estranged interest in the matter, or the most occult level shit you could imagine. This, as you can imagine, just made my mental state worse. I was now a complete mess. I couldn't focus, and I was scared to stand in front of a mirror just out of the paranoid fear that the other me would reach out and switch places with me. I even removed all the mirrors in my own home, either putting them in the trash or, for those fixed into the building, smashing them. Rumors began spreading about me. Whispers that I was having some kind of psychotic breakdown. Mirrors were barely coming out inspected for my station, and eventually my boss fired me. Disheartened, I went home and turned on the TV to try and relax. As if I was cursed to be haunted by strange occurrences, my heart stopped as the news came on. It was a report of a recent suicide. The victim had leapt off of a bridge into very shallow water, breaking his neck upon impact. They claimed that no one had ID'd the body, but upon showing an image of the corpse, I took a sharp breath. It was Greg. I immediately went into a frenzy. This couldn't be possible. Greg already died in the factory. It was a suicide. So why was the news reporting he had jumped off a bridge? The mirror theory made its way back into the spotlight. To me, a crazy paranoid mess of a man, it made perfect sense. Greg's reflection had come out, broken the mirror, killed the real Greg, and then left, because no one could tell the difference. But what about the sound of the mirror breaking? Perhaps it broke on the other side first? Yes, and then we wouldn't be able to hear it. The knocking. The knocking, the knocking. I hadn't heard my reflection knock. Then it came through a different pane and killed Greg. But then why did it kill itself? Maybe guilt? I decided there was only one course of action I could take: to infiltrate the factory and test my theory. I waited until night, and then using a work key I had forgotten to turn back in, I made my way towards the inspection area. As I came running around the corner with a small flashlight I had brought, I could see my reflection in one of the panes. But something was off about it. The light wasn't bouncing back. The mirror had absorbed the light. As I approached the mirror pane, I could see my reflection more clearly. It was smiling at me. I almost shouted in surprise, and my reflection noticed that. It began to talk, as its lips were moving, but I couldn't hear anything, so I cautiously pressed my ear up to the glass. A pair of lips grazed my ear. Thanks for touching the glass. A hand grabbed my arm, and we began to get into a scuffle. At some point, I dropped my flashlight, but the two of us were falling in and out between the two mirrors. My reflection seemed determined to always keep one part of either of us between both worlds, and constantly tried to fight me off and get into my world. The mirror became like a warm liquid as I flailed in and out between our worlds. As the fight continued, I grew more and more infuriated, and a rage boiled inside me. All the stress, the paranoia, my grief for Greg, all compounded into one raging outburst. I took my copycat by the head and began slamming it into the cement floor. He stopped moving after the third hit. It felt kinda good to let all of that out. Breathing heavily, I threw him over to his side and then scrambled for the flashlight on my side. I then threw the flashlight at the mirror. It shattered on impact, and I immediately got up and made my escape as guards rushed to the scene. When I got home, I rushed to bed and hid under my covers, squeezing my eyes shut. I eventually fell asleep, and it was the first good sleep I'd had in weeks. I was awoken by the ringing of my phone. I groaned, then moved over and reached for it on the night table drawer. "Hello?" I answered groggily.
Hey, Trevor, you hear about the factory yet?
The deepest chill slivered down my backbone. It was Greg. I couldn't respond, so I simply listened.
I guess not. Well, it seems like it was broken into during the night, so the police are investigating. The place won't be open again for a few days. You want to hang out? I've got some paper stuff to fill out, but when I'm done, I'll come over to your place. How does that sound? Won't be 2, maybe 3. Yeah, better make it 3 hours. Okay, bud?
My throat was in a knot, but I managed to swallow. Okay then. See you soon. I hung up, then sat in bed holding my head. The realization sinking in. I made a mistake. I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. And not long after, I realized something else. There was more than just one other side. And they weren't all break-ins. The guards, passing the mirrors at night, they didn't know. And then their copies came out, and they broke out of the factory. I wandered around my house for a while, trying to come to terms with what was happening. You know how people joke about people breaking into their homes and replacing everything with an exact replica of itself? I got that feeling from everything. It was uncomfortable and upsetting, as if I were trying to pretend that someone else's house was in fact my own. I grew furious once again and smashed a vase off the kitchen counter. It shattered, but it didn't feel right. I screamed savagely and grabbed a chair, smashing it around off the walls and floors. The wood splintered, but it didn't feel right. I ran the sinks until they overflowed, the water running across the floor and wetting my feet. It didn't feel right. Ripping open the fridge and scarfing down as much of my favorite food as I had, it didn't feel right. Eventually, my legs gave out and I slumped to the floor, holding my face and crying. But whether I was laughing or sobbing, I couldn't tell. It just felt good to destroy something. Eventually, once I had calmed down enough to think somewhat rationally, I tried to figure out how I'd get back. That's when I remembered all of you on the internet, turned on my computer and began writing this post. With that, we've come full circle, and now you know my story. But you see, as I was writing this, reliving these memories of a madman, I began to think, maybe being on your side isn't so bad. After all, they're not really my friends and family. They're all just copies. All of you are nothing but copies. I'm still feeling a little stressed out too. Maybe I'll have some fun on this side. Fun that I could never have over there. Maybe that's why the copies were coming through the mirror. They realized the truth too. They realized that, through the looking glass, there wasn't a white rabbit, or talking caterpillars, or a redneck queen. There were 7 billion lives, 7 billion copies, which they could play with however they pleased. So no need to send me links on how to get back to my world or any of that nonsense. Just consider this message a warning. I have to go now. Greg will be over any minute. And this time, he's going to stay dead. Farewell. How to beat the Sandman. Having difficulty staying awake there? Trying to study for some big exam? Finish some last-minute assignment that you put off all weekend, and it's now 3 in the morning and you are absolutely exhausted? Or perhaps you are in a similar state recently and are looking for help on what to do. Well, friend, I have just the prescription to ease your weary mind. All you need to do is win a game. Setting up the game is relatively simple. All you need is an hourglass, a candle, and a marker. Let me make one thing specifically clear. You need an hourglass, not one of those rinky-dink 30-second pieces of shit you get out of a cereal box or board game. Before playing the game, test your hourglass to make sure that it takes an hour or slightly longer to drain out all of the sand from one section to the other. Having it take slightly longer will help, but too long or too short, and you'll run into complications during the game. You must also be completely alone in the room while playing. When you're ready to play, choose any room that can be sealed, simply meaning that all doorways and windows can be closed. Any other form of timekeeping device or alarm must be taken out of the room prior, or the game will not begin. The hourglass will be your only time-tracking tool, hence why having an accurate hourglass is important. Anything with an electronic display should also be removed. This includes TVs, cell phones, computer monitors, anything. Leaving them in the room during the game will put you at a massive disadvantage. You may begin the game at 8 p.m. Make sure the room is sealed, drawing the curtains to block out any outside light, then draw a simplistic hourglass shape on the back of your hands. Make sure you remember well which hand it was, since you'll mostly be in the dark for this game. Take the candle and light it, then turn off the lights, and sit down on the floor with the 3 previously mentioned objects close together, and flip the hourglass so the sand begins to fall into an empty half. The only source of light should be your candle. Now, yell something along the lines of, "I'm not tired and I refuse to go to sleep." Close your eyes to the count of 10 and open them again. You won't be entirely sure, but somewhere in the room you'll think you can see the shadowy outline of a man. You have now begun the game, and your opponent is none other than the Master of Sleep himself, the Sandman. Do not provoke him, and don't speak to him either. You've challenged him, and in a way insulted him about his profession, so he's not in the best of moods to say the least. Now comes the game. Your task is to stay awake as long as possible, to a maximum of 8 hours, which will take you to 4 a.m. Every hour, you must flip the hourglass to reset it and keep the game going. Each time you flip the hourglass, you may take the marker and draw a tally mark on your arm. The specifics of which arm you mark will be explained later. And don't think you can just flip the hourglass 8 times really quickly or just draw 8 lines on your arm. The hour needs to pass in order for the magic to work. If you fail to flip the hourglass before the very last grain of sand falls, or should you succumb to sleep, you will lose. During this time, the Sandman will be deploying as many tricks as possible to get you to fall asleep or to give in. See, the bottom half of your hourglass at any time represents his power. The more sand in it, the stronger his influence will be. Almost immediately upon starting, you'll begin to feel drowsy. This is merely his presence. If you can't last against this, stop playing immediately. During the first hour, he won't do a lot. He may walk around the room, but he won't touch you or speak to you. Even if you try to talk to the being, which is something you should really avoid doing, there will be no response. Also, don't move from your spot to approach him. The closer you get, the more drowsy you will become, and if you're not near your candle, he may put it out so you can go to sleep. Do not distract yourself during this time. You may easily lose track of time and forget to flip the hourglass on time. The Sandman can also skew your perception of how much time has passed, but he cannot affect the hourglass, so keeping your focus on that is your best chance at winning. Side note, if you try to leave the room, you will find that the doors are all locked, and the windows reveal nothing but an unyielding darkness, as far as you can see. After you pass the first hour, the Sandman may scoff, but will continue to stay in the room. Now, he will begin to pull more from his bag of tricks. He's seen that you're going to be a hard one to put down. The sounds of music boxes and harps may be heard, at first from a distance, but will slowly grow to a level that would be audible and comforting. Resist the urge to close your eyes and listen. Your body will grow weary as you approach hour 2 or 3, depending on how the Sandman is feeling that night. Around this point, he will begin speaking to you in many voices. The soft voice of a young girl, the wise cackling laugh of a grandparent, or perhaps even in the ever-loving, recognizable words of your own mother. They will try to congratulate you on surviving for so long with the Sandman, for braving sleepless days and nights to win this game. Whispers of lullabies and nursery rhymes will fill your head, but you know better. Say nothing and ignore the voices. No matter how real they may seem, don't listen to them. Do not go to sleep. If you've managed to make it to the halfway point, and now have 4 marks on your arm, you'll be nothing less than exhausted, and the Sandman will be nothing less than enraged. He will begin to manipulate your environment even more, and start using new tactics to get you to sleep. Instead of trying to lull you to sleep, he will attack you. Hallucinations will occur. You'll see horrifying images of the dead hanging from the ceiling, flashed by a spotlight of unknown origin. The room may start to close in and then stretch out, and close in again and stretch back out. A whisper in your ear will turn into shouting in your face from an invisible source. Already weakened and sleep-deprived, your remaining energy will be drained in bursts from his terrors. You may have sudden adrenaline rushes, sure, but the Sandman is clever. He'll time them so that you can't just survive to the next hour by simply being anxious. He'll wait until your emotional state has fallen just another level lower, and then BAM! 2 rotted feet dangling in front of your face. You can scream all you want, you can beg for him to stop, but this will only use up more of your ability to function. At the 6-hour mark, The hallucinations will shift between horror and comfort, while the Sandman will begin to pick your brain and find what nightmares caused you to come to a cold sweat many a night. Others will coax you towards slumber, claiming that you've put up with enough and that you deserve a rest. A warm bed to tuck yourself into, a pillow made from the softest of furs and feathers. The harps and music boxes will start to overload your sense of hearing. In your state, you may welcome the chance to sleep, but snap out of it. Have you been watching the hourglass? Make sure his terrors aren't distracting you. This is why you don't talk to the Sandman. For every tiny detail about yourself you give him, he will use against you here. This is also the part where electronic displays can become a massive problem. They will turn on regardless of whether they are powered or not, and should you gaze upon their mystifying image for too long, your eyelids will droop and your body will collapse onto the floor. If you had just turned the screens away, the Sandman might use some muscle and turn it back towards you, so you can get a better view. The curtains may open to a brilliant dawn or a clear blue sky, but the only truths in its room are your arm and the hourglass. Unless you have 8 marks, this game is not over. Use any ounce of strength you have to flip that hourglass. Now, an immense chore from the Sandman's influence, scrawl a line down your arm with the marker, even if it looks like you're taking a knife and slashing your own arm open. During the final hour, the Sandman will begin to address you directly, asking you questions that appear to be simple. But as you are, you can't even remember what 2 + 2 equals. A question is the hardest thing to get out of your head, so don't let it get in. Cover your ears and just watch the hourglass. Keep those eyes open. Don't fall asleep. If the question gets in your head, you'll start to think about it, adding more stress and draining you of what little mental will you have left. It might become hard to breathe, as if something is squeezing your lungs, or the air is dense and hard to take. The Sandman will also get physical, grabbing you and throwing you across the room, leaving you to crawl back to the hourglass before time is up. If you catch a glimpse of his face, it may be enough of a nightmare to haunt you and keep your eyes from shutting. There will be no distinguishable facial features, save 2 bloody eyes, the lids torn from the sockets and endlessly staring. If you can't take it anymore at any point before the 8th hour is completed, take the hourglass and break it with all your might. Both sections must be broken for the game to end, and for your sake, I hope it was made of glass. Anyone who has made it to the 7th hour mark has never had the strength to successfully break it, and either carried on or surrendered to their dreams. You will not receive a reward for ending the game this way, save the mercy of avoiding the Sandman's wrath. If you do make it to the end of the 8th hour without falling asleep, you will not need to flip the hourglass again. Simply make the 8th mark on your arm and close your eyes. Though you ended the game, you could not sleep just yet. There's one final task remaining. All you must do is wait for the Sandman to collect the hourglass and say, "You're all grown up now. Sleep when you wish." Open your eyes and find that the hourglass is gone and the candle put out. Now you may collapse and slumber. A 12-hour slumber to be precise. The game puts a heavy strain on your mind and body, so recovery is necessary. But it's the last sleep you'll ever need. Or at least to that length, because once you've fully recovered, you will be able to stay awake for an extra hour for each tally on your marked arm. Depending on your normal sleep schedule, this may mean you only need a small nap, maybe an hour or 2 at most, but for some, you'll never have to lie down again. Sure, you will have the ability to do so if you want to. You can even still dream, but there will never be any weariness following you. Just think of how productive you can be. But it's not all sugar plums and gumdrops. If you mark any tallies on the arm that was not marked by the hourglass, you will instead require more sleep. 1 hour for each tally on the blank arm to be precise. You will require more rest to be able to even function throughout your day. Now, these marks can cancel with the ones on your marked arm, but if that's not the case, you may have just gone through all that suffering only to come out worse than before. And what with your delirious state throughout the game, it's unlikely for the average individual to come out with all their tallies on the marked arm. There are also the circumstances of losing. If you fail to flip the hourglass, then the Sandman will gain full power, and with a snap of his fingers, you will collapse to the ground. Regardless of how you fall asleep, be it by failure of the hourglass or succumbing to your own tiredness, you will also sleep for 12 hours for recover, but it will be the worst sleep you will ever have, and the Sandman will make damn sure that's the case. The worst nightmares will flood your mind, leaving you unable to escape or wake up in a relief-filled cold sweat. All you can do is endure the torture of a dream that feels like years in length. And when you finally come to consciousness the next morning, there you will be, lying on the floor of the room, the marks still on your arm, blood flowing from where your eyelids once rested. You said you refused to close your eyes and go to sleep. The Sandman has simply granted that wish. The world is quiet here. Darcy Turner loved silence. He had a fondness for music, classical mainly, but voices were grating, rough like sandpaper on his eardrums. He hated kids even more, always screaming and yelling and running around making noise. But his favorite sound of all was when there was a lack thereof, a rarity to find in this day and age. As he strolled down the sidewalk, Darcy paused for a moment and looked at the tricycle tipped over in a driveway. He looked up and after a moment recognized the home. The Richardsons, family of 5, 3 kids. The youngest boy was always screaming, whether he was playing or asking for a drink of water. Not only that, but the boy had a shrill voice that pierced one's ears. The little shit also had a habit of hitting people and then running away outside to escape on his tricycle and join his friends down the street. Absolutely spoiled. It was kind of a relief, seeing that 3-wheeled vehicle sitting lifeless on the cement. Darcy smiled softly, then continued on through the neighborhood. The morning mist swirled around his legs, blanketing the suburbia in a knee-deep fog. There was a light gray, covered with heavy clouds but illuminated by the rising sun from behind. The air was fairly cool for summer, and there was almost no wind, the trees lining Kaiser Avenue standing nearly still. An instant later, a sharp pain shot up his body from his knee. Darcy blinked and realized he was on the ground. He had tripped and hit his knee on the cement, but this did not bother him. What frightened him was that he had lost his grip on his baton. Darcy sat up and anxiously scanned the area, then looked below to find it resting under his leg. He got up in a hurry and retrieved his precious tool, inspecting it for any signs of damage. Once he was certain it was still intact, He sighed in relief and chuckled, rubbing his knee. The pain reminded him of Lucy. The mutt had bit him once as he was fixing Miss Murphy's system, an issue also caused by the chewing of the dog on some certain cables. Darcy had almost kicked the damn thing, but Murphy showed up to apologize for her whittle Lucy baby. Every repair job at that place, which was often due to the dog repeatedly tearing apart wiring, was miserable. He would try to wear earbuds to listen to his music while he worked, but either the mutt or Murphy herself always had something to bark about for the entirety of the job. How the hell do you accrue enough wealth to live here and yet don't have the brains to discipline your dog? Or yourself? The answer to this question always eluded Darcy, and eventually he stopped asking. Kaiser Avenue was on the richer side of town. It was part of a subdivision filled with beautiful houses for the upper middle class, with lush and well-tended green lawns to hold barbecues on. And the pools. Ah yes, everyone loved their pools. One time, when Darcy had to repair a unit that was going off every time the dog ran by it, the Grant kids had splashed him while his back was turned. He laughed it off at first, but when they began throwing the pool toys at him, he took it more seriously. Mrs. Grant came out and yelled as well when he tried to approach the kids, then told him to leave without finishing the repair. His boss wasn't too happy about that one either. But none of that mattered now. That was the past, this was the present, and the world was quiet here, just like he liked it. A bird chirped and fluttered above Darcy. He watched it go, making its way to a nest down the avenue in another tree. Of the few sounds Darcy could stand, this was the most beautiful. Oh, how it must have felt to be free, and to have a voice that sung so sweetly. He took the baton in his hand and waved it in the air, synchronizing with the voice of his avian friend, until he had convinced himself that he was the one orchestrating that song. Tracy, the eldest daughter of the Monroes, she had a great singing voice. Darcy always looked forward to any job at the Monroes because she was constantly practicing. Not only that, but Tracy enjoyed his company, and they would speak in soft voices at great lengths, mostly about music and singing. Though he was generally very negative about most things outside of that realm, should the topic arise, she didn't seem to mind. Out of everyone on this gluttonous, hubris-ridden lane, Tracy was the only one that Darcy didn't have to tolerate. He embraced her company, and she his. Mr. Monroe, however, certainly did. The chunky old fuck, pushing into his 60s at that point, would always interrupt with his deep, burly shouting and make Darcy finish the repair immediately, with a prompt slamming of the front door on his way out. Darcy could easily recall the day he first installed the system into their house. He had been out back laying down sensors when Mr. Monroe came over and just started watching him. Crunching on an apple, he hovered over Darcy for the rest of the installation. At one point, Darcy had politely asked him to back up a bit so he wouldn't hit Mr. Monroe with a pole, to which he responded, "Oh, now you're gonna threaten to hit me? Have a problem with me making sure I'm getting my money's worth? Well, maybe you can get the fuck out, and I'll have someone more competent do the job." Darcy remembered blood dripping from his hand that day. His fingernails bore their way into his palm as he clenched his fists, just barely holding back from knocking the old fart on his ass and smashing his head into jam. Instead, he nodded, apologized with a quiet voice, and returned to his work. Each and every day, this was his job, going door to door on Kaiser Avenue, checking out repair and installation requests for the Harris Security System Company. And at every house, there were a pair of cranky geezers with some kind of eternal gripe against youth, save their own overly spoilt children, who were usually the ones responsible for breaking the system in the first place. And after a long day of putting up with people's shit, he'd come home to the bitch. Donna always had something petty to complain about from her job at a local cafe. There was this one guy who didn't even tip me, even after I made it clear that was what you're supposed to do. Like, sorry, asshole. But anytime Darcy would try to softly speak about his grievances, she would never even consider hearing about Darcy's day. She'd either just cut him off with her own stories, or say she was late for some bullshit and leave the apartment. A boiling anger started with Darcy, but he tried with all his might to contain it. Standing there in the middle of the street, he gritted his teeth and closed his eyes, but the memories flooded to him anyways. Donna's birthday was last night. When she came to him asking for her gift, Darcy blankly pulled out a metal tube of sorts. What the fuck is this? Some kind of weird sex toy? Is this seriously what you got me? Donna made a disgusted face, the one he'd grown to see all too often. Darcy took the tube back. No, he replied, reaching for his back. Gripping his baton, he spun the tube onto it and simply replied, "This is." Though he hated this woman so, he conducted a fine piece for her. Something to the suit of Beethoven. Deep and drumming was their breakup, bellowing from the bottom of his heart. One final song before she left, and they parted ways that night. Darcy began to pack his bag, the baton, some sheet music, and his laptop for work stuff. Darcy had been thinking about this for weeks. No, more than that. More than months. This was years in the making. Ever since he was a child, he had always wished to conduct a massive symphony, and this was his chance. He reached the avenue at about 4:30 in the morning. Though everyone on the avenue owned a Harris security system, the people there weren't of enough importance to hire wandering security. Save that shit for Bel Air. He entered onto the street, parked his van, and reached for his laptop. After logging a repair job, he deactivated all of the systems on Kaiser Avenue. It's time for the show. He began at Richardson's, entering around the back through a sliding door. He started his way upstairs, moving slowly as to not cause a creak on the floorboards. His sheet led him up to the children's room. The best kind of music starts at piano, he thought. The door was open just a tad. Enough for him to open some more and begin the song. After a couple notes, there were sounds of movement in the house. The audience had begun to stir, moving from room to room. Darcy grabbed the residents with his music, but he quickly lost their attention, and their cheers disappeared. Frowning, Darcy decided to find a new audience. Next door was Murphy. Someone as sophisticated as her must have an appreciation for good music. Entering the front door, one of the drummers started going by her own beat. Darcy scanned his orchestra and found the rogue, then quickly signaled for the rest of the players to show her how music is truly played. Patting Lucy's hair, Darcy looked up to Murphy watching him play. He smiled and gave her a short solo segment. Darcy continued through the neighborhood, his symphony ringing through each household, but each time his new audience grew too bored too quickly and went back to sleep. Eventually he reached the Monroes. Darcy wiped his brow. He had saved the best part for last, for Tracy. In her room, he gestured for a single violinist to hold a single note as long as they could. He nodded and did so, dragging the bow over the string with the greatest of care. Crash! The clash of cymbals erupted from behind Darcy, bringing the orchestra into fortissimo. He turned to find Tracy's father standing there, his own baton in hand, trying to take the stage. Enraged, Darcy attacked Mr. Monroe. "No, no, this is my song," he screamed, taking his baton and smashing Monroe in the nose with the handle. A ribbon of crimson flowed around them as Darcy continued hitting Monroe, the metal butt crushing the skull, the symphony having fallen silent by this point, save one pianist hitting the deepest note he could over and over and over again. Monroe coughed and more blood splattered onto the floor of the concert hall. Darcy's eyes flamed in rage. He took the violinist's bow and jammed it into the fat man's gut, more ribbon spilling from his innards. The pianist fell silent, and the only sound that remained was that of squishing flesh being penetrated by Darcy's blade. Once he was satisfied, Darcy stood up and looked down upon his work. He turned his head and looked towards his darling Tracy, her white sheets coated in a spray of blood that continued to leak from her beautiful neck. Wiping a tear away, he approached her and closed her panic-stricken eyes, then combed her hair with his fingers. "I'm sorry. I'll never forgive myself for destroying such a beautiful voice." With the symphony concluded, Darcy Turner walked outside. A light fog had rolled in. He looked at the silenced .22 in his hand and closed his eyes. The neighborhood was quiet. There were no screaming children, no angry seniors, no barking bitches, just blissful silence to complement the conclusion of his masterpiece. And who knows, perhaps someone out there was calling for an encore. He chuckled to himself at the thought. They'd have to wait. For now, it was time to relax and bask in this quiet new world he had created. After all, Darcy Turner loved silence. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed those stories. If you did, be sure to let me know in the comments and leave a like. If you didn't enjoy the content, leave a dislike and let me know how I can do better. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to my $5 horror nerd patron, As the Raven Dreams. He's a fellow horror narrator and makes very excellent content, so be sure to check him out as well. And if you'd like to help support the channel as well, be sure to visit patreon.com/nerdxcorexcreep. I currently have 2 tiers, including a $1 nerd tier, which is general support, and the $5 horror nerd tier, which is also for support, but will also grant you MP3 downloads of future narrations, early access, and a shout out at the end of each video. If you'd like me to narrate one of your stories, be sure to get a hold of me on any of the social medias listed in the description. I'm available on Twitter at twitter.com/nerdxcorexcreep, as well as Reddit at username nerdxcorexcreep, or you can submit your stories to my subreddit, r/horrorxnerds. It is a new year, and I plan on taking my channel in a new direction. On top of horror narrations, I do plan on expanding the type of content I produce, including Let's Plays, Top 10 Countdowns, reactions, and more. And if you have any suggestions on what type of content you'd like to see me produce, be sure to let me know. I will also be changing up my release schedule to Saturday nights, which will now include multiple stories in one video. This will allow me more time to produce the best content possible. And as always, if you haven't subscribed, be sure to do so. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Have a creepy night.